Hey guys, welcome back. Let's do something wild tonight. Let's time travel, but not with flying cars or futuristic tech. No, we're heading backward, way back. Before TikTok, before Hollywood, even before mirrors became a household item. Close your eyes for a second and imagine this. You're standing in a stone chamber lit only by firelight. You smell beeswax candles, maybe some rosemary hanging from the rafters. Outside, it's cold. Inside, it's quiet, except for the soft sound of a woman plucking out her hairline. Not her eyebrows, her actual hairline. Why? Because in medieval Europe, a high forehead meant elegance. It meant purity, wealth, femininity. The more your forehead resembled a moonlit slope, the more society saw you as refined. So women would literally rip out their own hair to look right. Sounds extreme. That was only the beginning. Back then, beauty wasn't about self-expression. It was a game of survival. Let's start with skin. Today, everyone's chasing a golden tan, that sun-kissed influencer glow. But in the medieval world, the whiter your skin, the higher your status. Pale skin said, "I don't work in the fields, I stay indoors, I'm protected, I'm valuable." And they didn't just rely on good genes. Oh no. Women used chalk, vinegar, even lead-based creams, yes, lead, to bleach their faces. They knew it was dangerous. They knew it could kill. But dying slowly from toxic makeup was still considered better than being seen as common. Let that sink in. And hair. Hair was sacred and shameful at the same time. A woman's loose hair was considered seductive, even demonic. If it wasn't covered, braided, or bound, people thought it invited sin, or worse, possession. Married women never let their hair down in public. Virgins might, but only until the wedding night. After that, your strands got locked away under wimples and veils. Now here's the twist. The less of a woman you saw, the more beautiful she was considered. Think about that. Beauty was tied to invisibility, mystery, control. A good woman didn't show too much skin. She didn't laugh too loudly. She didn't flirt. Her beauty was supposed to exist only for her husband or God. But that didn't mean she wasn't judged. Oh, she was. Harshly, constantly. A round face meant fertility. Wide hips meant you could bear sons. Rosy cheeks said you were healthy. Everything meant something. Every curve, every blemish, every freckle could be read like a moral code. You weren't just beautiful, you were worthy or unworthy. And here's the sick irony. If you were beautiful, you were seen as a temptation, a threat, a walking sin. Women were warned that their looks could damn a man's soul. Priests preached that vanity was the gateway to hell. But those same preachers painted angels to look like blushing maidens and imagined the Virgin Mary as the perfect face of grace. So women were trapped: be beautiful but don't know it. Shine but never too brightly. Attract but don't seduce. Sound familiar. And yet somehow through all this pressure, women still found ways to own beauty. Even in the poorest villages, girls would crush beetroot and rub it into their cheeks. They'd chew mint leaves before market day. They'd braid flowers into their hair for a little sparkle. In secret gardens, they whispered recipes to one another. Elderflower and milk for soft skin. Honey and almond for facial masks. Thyme to tighten the pores. Vinegar infused with lavender to rinse the scalp. Beauty wasn't just in royal courts. It was in kitchens, gardens, convents, anywhere women had hands and time and something to believe in. And that brings us to something bigger. Because the more you look at beauty through history, the more you realize it was never just about looking good. It was about fitting in, staying safe, being desirable but not too desirable, being visible but never too visible, being silent still, manageable, and if you were too loud, too dark, too curvy, too thin, too strange, you were dangerous. You were a witch, a sinner, an outcast, and yet women kept resisting. Let's step outside Europe for a moment. In Japan during the Heian period, women had different ideals. They painted their faces white with rice powder, shaved their eyebrows and drew new ones higher on the forehead, and dyed their teeth black with a lacquer called ohaguro. Why? Because black teeth were seen as mysterious, elegant, and spiritual. Strange to us, maybe, but to them, it was beautiful. In India, turmeric and sandalwood were mixed into pastes to soothe and brighten the skin. Henna wasn't just decoration, it was sacred. In West Africa, shea butter nourished the skin under a blazing sun, and hairstyles were braided with meaning. Your age, your clan, your mood, your spirit. Across the Islamic world, women painted their eyes with kohl, not just for allure but to protect against the sun and evil spirits. And in the bathhouses, hammems, they gathered to scrub, steam, gossip, and glow. Beauty wasn't solitary. It was social, communal, joyful. So here's the big idea I want you to carry with you. Beauty has never been neutral. It's always been shaped by power. In rich societies, it was a marker of wealth. In patriarchal systems, it was a tool of control. In colonized worlds, it became a weapon, used to erase indigenous pride and replace it with European ideals. But in every corner, women fought back with eyeliner, with braids, with herbs and perfumes and poems. Sometimes they whispered their rebellion. Sometimes they danced it. Sometimes they hid it in plain sight. And even now, we still feel the echo. We're still bleaching, contouring, waxing, whitening, trimming, tanning, plucking, stretching, trying to measure up to standards someone else invented centuries ago. But what if we stopped? What if, instead of asking, "Am I beautiful?" we started asking, "Who taught me to want this?" What if beauty isn't about rules, but about story? What if your face, your hair, your skin, just as it is, isn't a problem to fix, but a legacy to honor? Because the truth is, every wrinkle, every scar, every freckle carries a history, a survival, a choice, and that's beautiful. So thank you for coming on this journey with me. This is just the beginning. In part 2, we're diving deeper into corsets, foot binding, waistlines, and the centuries-long war over the female body. But for now, I hope you look in the mirror tonight and see more than features. I hope you see firelight, braided stories, sacred rebellion. See you in the next chapter. Let's pick up where we left off, at the edge of the mirror, where beauty becomes less about reflection and more about restriction. Imagine tightening something around your waist so fiercely that you can barely breathe. Not for battle, but for beauty. That was the reality for generations of women. Because in the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, beauty took on a new shape, literally. Welcome to the rise of the corset. Now, these weren't just fashion statements. They were armor disguised as elegance. Corsets weren't originally about seduction, they were about discipline. They trained the body to conform to a specific silhouette. High restrained bust, cinched waist, flat stomach. Not because it looked sexy, but because it looked controlled. And control in a patriarchal society was everything. You see, a woman who moved gracefully, who sat up straight, who looked physically restricted, she was signaling something. That she was refined, obedient, unburdened by labor. Her very shape told a story of class and submission. But let me ask you, how do you breathe when beauty demands your breath? Girls started wearing these bodices young, some as early as age 10. Over time, the pressure wasn't just physical, it was cultural. A tightly laced waist was a ticket to a better marriage, better status, better life. The tighter the waist, the higher the worth. And it didn't stop there. Fashion began sculpting the entire female form. In Tudor England, farthingales, wide hoop skirts, created enormous silhouettes that made walking nearly impossible. Later, panniers spread skirts sideways to such absurd widths that women had to turn sideways to pass through doorways. Practical? Not at all. But that wasn't the point. These shapes screamed luxury, power. A woman in such clothes clearly wasn't scrubbing floors or chasing livestock. She was decorative, untouchable, contained. And yet, women found ways to hack even these rules. In Italy, sleeves were designed to detach so women could swap them out and subtly showcase their arms. In France, necklines dipped daringly low, defying the modesty codes of the church. In private, some women even loosened their stays or padded their hips, not for men but for themselves. Because beauty, for all its rules, always leaves room for rebellion. Let's zoom out now. Across the world, the shaping of the female body was a global phenomenon. In China, foot binding had become entrenched. It began among the upper classes, inspired by the dancer Yao Niang and her legendary lotus steps. But over centuries, it spread like a painful wildfire. Little girls, some as young as 4, had their feet broken and bound to fit a 3-inch ideal. Their bones bent unnaturally, their toes tucked under their soles. Why? Because a woman with bound feet couldn't walk far, couldn't work. She had to be carried. And in that helplessness, society saw elegance, purity, femininity. It was brutal. And yet many families continued the practice for generations. Because bound feet meant better prospects. Without them, a girl might never marry. Beauty was her only ladder, and that ladder was made of pain. But in Africa, the ideals looked very different. Among the Zulu and Ashanti, full-bodied figures were celebrated. Wide hips, rounded bellies, and generous thighs were signs of fertility and strength. Waist beads, worn under clothing, weren't just decorative. They tracked body changes, honored rites of passage, and enhanced sensuality. Scarification was practiced not out of brutality but identity. Each line, each pattern told a story of lineage, courage, belonging. In India, beauty was deeply tied to ritual. Ayurvedic texts prescribed oils, herbs, and bathings to balance the body's doshas. Women anointed themselves with sandalwood paste to cool the skin, turmeric to brighten it, and jasmine oil to perfume the hair. It wasn't just about appearance. It was about alignment with nature, with spirit. And across the Islamic world, Women adorned their eyes with kohl not only for allure but for protection, from both the desert sun and the evil eye. Rosewater softened the skin. Hammams, public bathhouses, became communal sanctuaries where women of all classes exfoliated, laughed, shared recipes, and connected. Beauty here wasn't solitary, it was sisterhood. But let's come back to a difficult truth. When empires expanded, when colonizers arrived, when foreign powers took root, they often brought new ideals and erased the old. Suddenly, African hairstyles were called primitive. Indian turmeric pastes became home remedies. Japanese practices like ohagura, blackening the teeth, were ridiculed. Women were told their traditions weren't sophisticated enough. Their beauty wasn't universal. But here's the thing. Universal beauty has always been a myth designed by those in power. It's no coincidence that European standards, pale skin, narrow noses, delicate features, became dominant across the globe. These weren't just preferences. They were tools for exclusion, for shame, for control, and women around the world felt it. They were told to powder their faces lighter, straighten their hair, hide their curves, smile smaller, speak softer. But history isn't just about compliance. It's also about resistance. There were women who refused, who wore their kente cloth with pride, who kept their braids tight and sacred, who passed down their rituals in secret from mother to daughter, who wore their corsets loose and their spirits unbound. And that resistance matters, because every act of self-beautifying in a world that says you're not enough is revolutionary. So next time someone tells you beauty is shallow, remind them, beauty built empires. It destroyed queens and crowned others. It was written into laws, painted into ceilings, whispered into lullabies, weaponized, worshipped, and feared. And women, they endured it, molded it, rewrote it. We're going to peel back another layer into the world of faces. Facial expressions, makeup, and the strange rules about who was allowed to smile and when. But until then, here's a thought to carry with you. What if your waist, your hips, your gait weren't flaws to be hidden or fixed, but echoes of ancient power? What if beauty has always been your birthright, not your burden? And if part 2 taught us anything, it's this. When the world tells women to shrink, to lace themselves up, to fit into molds, they find ways to unlace, to breathe, to rebel. Let's keep going. Because now we're moving from corsets and crinolines to faces. The human face, the canvas of identity, emotion, judgment, but also control. Let me ask you something. When was the last time someone told you to smile? Now imagine being told that every day, not just by friends or strangers, but by art, by religion, by tradition, by your role in society. In medieval Europe, women didn't smile in portraits. You'll see them with downcast eyes, lips pressed softly together, expression unreadable. Why? Because beauty wasn't about joy, it was about stillness, modesty, control. A woman who smiled too broadly was considered vulgar, maybe even immoral. Laughing, that was dangerous. The church warned against it, philosophers condemned it. Emotion belonged to the unruly, the improper, the unholy. The ideal face, pale, composed, slightly flushed cheeks but never too much. A soft bloom, not desire. A pious glow, not passion. Even in oil and gold leaf, a woman's face was not her own. It was curated, censored, softened. But again, women found ways to reclaim it. They mixed their own pigments, crushed berries for lip tint, burnt almonds for eyeliner, elderflower water to soothe and glow. These weren't beauty tricks, they were rituals, acts of power in tiny doses. And this wasn't just Europe. In ancient China, during the Tang and Song dynasties, a woman's beauty was described in poetry, not paint. Her eyes like autumn water, her brows like distant mountains. Her presence was delicate, her movements soft. But still, every gesture, every line of the face was scripted. Brows were plucked and redrawn in specific shapes, each with meaning. Upright for seriousness, curved for charm, arched for nobility. In Mughal India, women lined their eyes in thick kohl, not only for allure but protection. Kohl warded off the evil eye. Babies wore it. Brides wore it. Queens wore it. Red dyes from flowers and beetles stained lips and cheeks. But even here there was a line. Too much makeup. You were vain, not enough. Unkempt, just enough. Virtuous. The balance was delicate and exhausting. In Mesoamerica, among the Maya and Aztec civilizations, beauty was bold. Faces were painted for ceremony, for battle, for identity. Foreheads were shaped in infancy. Noses pierced. Cheeks marked. Beauty wasn't hidden, it was worn like armor. But what happens when your face, your natural face, doesn't match the ideal? What if your lips are full when the ideal is small? What if your skin is dark when the ideal is pale? What if your eyes are narrow when the ideal is round? You're told to change, to fix, to hide. This is where beauty becomes moral, not just aesthetic. In many religious societies, physical beauty was said to reflect spiritual virtue. A woman who looked plain but behaved piously was praised. But here's the twist. She was still expected to be attractive enough. Not too much, not too little, just enough to please but never provoke. Too pretty, you're tempting men. Too plain, you're failing your duty. Try too hard. You're vain, don't try at all. You're lazy. The tightrope never ends. And that didn't stop in the Middle Ages. Even today, women wear makeup not just to look good, but to be taken seriously. To seem awake, put together, professional. A man can walk into a meeting with bedhead. A woman must arrive with foundation, concealer, and 3 shades of eyeshadow, or risk being seen as tired, emotional, sloppy. And here's the irony, a bare face is seen as brave. A made-up face is trying too hard. You can't win. But through all this, the face never stops speaking. It speaks through a raised brow, a bitten lip, a smudge of rouge, a scar left untouched, a freckle left visible. The face is a diary written in skin, and women have always used it to tell stories no one else wanted to read. Now let's move down the body again, because beauty isn't just about the face. It's about the form. And for centuries, cultures have tried to define what the ideal female body should look like. In medieval Europe, it wasn't the curvaceous Renaissance goddess or the lean modern model. The ideal was a soft, rounded figure, narrow shoulders, small bust, full belly, subtle hips, a silhouette that suggested gentleness, modesty, fertility, but never sensuality. And yet, even this natural look was engineered. Women wore tight-fitting kirtles beneath layers of skirts and surcoats. Not quite corsets, but early versions. The body had to be shaped, compressed, controlled, hidden. Beauty wasn't about freedom. It was about being proper. A smooth line under fabric meant wealth. A pinched waist meant discipline. And above all, the body had to signal, I don't work, I'm above labor. But across the world, other ideals reigned. In China, during the Tang dynasty, a fuller figure was prized. Round cheeks, plump arms. Softness meant health, fertility, prosperity, but that changed. By the Ming dynasty, modesty took over. The most shocking of all, foot binding. Let's stop here, because foot binding isn't just a beauty practice. It's a horror story wrapped in silk. Girls as young as 4 had their feet broken and bound. The goal? Feet no longer than 3 inches, lotus feet. A woman with tiny, broken feet couldn't walk properly. She shuffled, she swayed, and this was seen as elegant, feminine, desirable. The pain was unimaginable, the risk of infection constant. But families went through with it, because without bound feet, a girl might never marry, might never rise in society. Beauty wasn't just pressure, it was prerequisite. In Europe, it was the farthingale, those massive hoop skirts. Women swayed through ballrooms with 6 feet of silk dragging behind them, unable to sit or pass through doors. But that was the point. If you couldn't move freely, it meant you didn't have to. You were valuable enough to be carried, to be served, to be still. In West Africa, ideals were different. Fullness meant fertility, strength, vitality. Waist beads accented curves, not hid them. Scarification told a woman's life story across her body, her tribe, her trials, her status. Beauty wasn't silence, it was storytelling. Among the fierce Dahomey Amazons, Africa's all-female military regiment, beauty was discipline. Grace in motion, elegance in posture. Even warriors knew the power of a look, a walk, a still gaze. And in India, Ayurvedic texts mapped beauty to health and balance. Turmeric for glow, sandalwood for scent. The Kama Sutra didn't just teach pleasure, it taught how to walk, dress, move, nourish, adorn. Beauty was sacred, not shameful. But in every case, from palace to peasant hut, the body wasn't just seen. It was shaped. By hand, by culture, by force. And that leads us to the next battlefield, the fabric that touched that body. Because if beauty demands transformation, clothing becomes the tool. And in part 4, we'll explore how veils, wigs, perfumes, powders, and pigments became weapons in the centuries-long war over how women were allowed to appear and disappear. And now that we've explored how the body was shaped, praised, bound, and judged, it's time to talk about the things that touched it. Because clothing, my friends, was never just about modesty or climate. It was language. It was law. It was camouflage and spotlight at the same time. Let's start with something seemingly simple, the veil. Across cultures, the veil has covered heads, faces, shoulders. It's been stitched in gold, edged in lace, or plain as homespun cloth. But don't be fooled. Veils are rarely just fabric. In Christian Europe, a married woman wore a veil to signal purity, obedience, and social role. In Islamic societies, veiling became a cultural and spiritual symbol, tied to modesty, but also respectability and class. Nuns veiled in devotion, widows veiled in mourning, daughters veiled for weddings. A veil could mean, I am off limits, or I am devout, or sometimes you don't get to know. It was both shield and sentence. But then we move to the head itself. Hair, the crown of beauty across nearly every civilization, which is why it so often had to be hidden. Because free-flowing hair was powerful. It hinted at sexuality, independence, even chaos. So what do you do when a woman's power makes you nervous? You cover it, you cut it, you tame it. In medieval Europe, hair was braided, covered, and coiled. In ancient Egypt, heads were shaved for hygiene and wigs were worn to display status, thick, black, perfumed, and structured. In 17th century France, hair became a form of architectural ambition, towering wigs that defied gravity and common sense. The higher the wig, the closer to God. No, the closer to the king. Women stuffed their hair with wire, flower, horsehair. They powdered it white, adorned it with birds, ships, fruit. Yes, actual fruit. It was spectacle as social proof. You had the time, the help, the status. You mattered. And then perfume. Today we wear fragrance for pleasure, for flirtation, for fun. But in the Middle Ages, scent was survival. People believed foul air caused disease, so noblewomen carried pomanders, tiny filigree balls stuffed with herbs to hold beneath their noses. Clove for cleansing, rosemary for memory, myrrh for sanctity. Scent was medicine, magic, and mystery. In India, sandalwood paste wasn't just sensual, it was spiritual. It cooled the skin, calmed the nerves, drew you closer to the divine. In Persia, rose water was everywhere, sprinkled in baths, rubbed on wrists, poured into the air during ceremonies. Smelling good meant you were clean, holy, cared for. And that brings us to paint, cosmetics, color on skin. Across continents and centuries, women turned to pigments to tell their stories. In high-end Japan, noblewomen powdered their faces ghost white and blackened their teeth. Because the farther your beauty drifted from the natural, the more refined it was thought to be. Eyebrows were removed entirely and redrawn high on the forehead. Beauty was geometry. In Renaissance Europe, women dusted their faces with lead-based powder. Yes, lead. Deadly. But it gave them that porcelain finish. Belladonna drops dilated the pupils. Rouge reddened the cheeks. Lips were tinted crimson. The goal, not health, not youth, but elegance, fragile elegance. The kind that came with risk. The kind that whispered, I don't need to work. I might not even need to live. And still, women did it. Not because they were vain, because they were watched. To be female was to be looked at, judged, scanned. And every smudge of color, every accessory, every fold of fabric was a shield and a mirror. This is who I am, they said while thinking, please let this be enough. But there's something else, too. Because as much as these rituals were about conformity, they were also about community. In bathhouses across the Islamic world, women gathered not just to clean themselves, but to beautify each other. Hammems were sacred spaces, steam rising, laughter echoing, rosewater splashing. Women exfoliated, perfumed, braided, whispered. It wasn't vanity, it was sisterhood. In Africa, women passed down recipes for skin salves, oils, and dyes. Shea butter, clay, ash, all mixed by hand. Every tribe had its own rituals. Every style had a meaning. Braids told of age, status, grief, celebration. Beauty was cultural memory sculpted on the body. In South America, women used crushed insects for lip color, ground charcoal for eyeliner, and pressed flowers for scent. These weren't accessories. They were ancestral codes. And in all these places, across oceans and empires, beauty was work. Emotional, physical, communal work. You learned from your mother, from your grandmother, from your aunts, your sisters, the women who loved you enough to pass on knowledge in oils and whispers. And sometimes that knowledge was dangerous, because as soon as colonizers arrived, those rituals were the first to be erased. Europeans labeled indigenous beauty as primitive, called scarification barbaric, called dark skin dirty, replaced plant-based dyes with chemical bleaches, demonized nose rings, mocked body paint, and then repackaged it all in fashion magazines a few centuries later. Exotic, boho, tribal chic. They took what was sacred and sold it back as trend. So what does that tell us? It tells us beauty was never just about looking good. It was about staying safe, staying seen, staying alive. It was how women claimed space in a world that kept trying to shrink them. And when you understand that, suddenly lipstick isn't just lipstick. It's armor. So in part 5, we're going even deeper into the role of mirrors, muses, mythology, and media. How beauty was painted, written, and worshipped, sometimes by women, but most often by men. So we've bathed in rose water, laced our corsets, powdered our cheeks, and whispered stories into silk veils. But now let's talk about reflection. Literally. Because before the 13th century, before the invention of silver-backed glass mirrors, most people had never truly seen their own faces. Not in detail. They relied on pools of water, polished metal, hazy shadows. Imagine that, your self-image built from blurs and memory. It wasn't until clearer mirrors became common that things changed. Suddenly, people could see every pore, every wrinkle, every imagined flaw. And with that clarity came a new kind of obsession, a new kind of pressure, and eventually a new kind of business. Because insecurity, it sells lotions, powders, brushes, bottles promising to smooth, brighten, lift, tighten. The birth of the modern beauty industry wasn't just about hygiene, it was about control. If women were taught to scrutinize themselves, they could be taught to fix themselves. And fixing, of course, costs money. But let's zoom out again. Because before the mirror, before the makeup counter, beauty was defined in other ways. Through art, through myth, through story. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, portraits weren't photographs. They were propaganda. When a princess was painted, it wasn't to capture her personality. It was to sell her to another kingdom. Her pale skin, high brow, calm expression, folded hands, they weren't just aesthetic. They were messages. I am pure. I am obedient. I will bear heirs. Everything was deliberate, and everything was strategic. But let's not stop at portraits. Literature played just as big a role. In courtly love poetry, women were angels, distant, silent, untouchable. Their skin was described like alabaster, their lips like ripe cherries, their eyes like stars or water or fire, but always in metaphor, never in reality. These women weren't human. They were symbols, and symbols don't get to speak. Then came religion. And if you thought the poets were strict, the priests were stricter. In Christian Europe, the Virgin Mary became the ultimate ideal of femininity. She was everything a woman was supposed to be. Gentle, quiet, modest, motherly, not seductive, not bold, not complicated, just good. And if you were Mary, well, then you were probably Magdalene, the sinner, the temptress, the cautionary tale, see the problem. It was a binary trap, be holy or be damned, be perfect or be punished. There was no space for nuance, for humanity, for the messy middle where most real women live. But the strangest part, those ideals didn't stay in cathedrals and books. They moved, they traveled. As Europe colonized the world, so did its beauty standards. Pale skin became a global ideal. Straight hair, small noses, thin bodies, all of it exported. Sometimes through religion, sometimes through education, sometimes through force. And the result, a global beauty hierarchy, one that still lingers, one that still whispers in ads and apps and algorithms, "You're almost beautiful if only you were a little lighter, a little thinner, a little less you." And let's not pretend we've escaped it. Turn on your phone, scroll for 10 seconds, and you'll see it. The same filtered faces, the same sculpted bodies, the same frozen smiles. But let's go back again for something different. Let's talk about resistance. Because not every woman bought the myth. Some cracked the mirror, some tore up the script. In 1405, Christine de Pizan, a widow, a mother, a writer, published the Book of the City of Ladies. While men were still writing poems about how virtuous and voiceless women should be, Christine built a metaphorical city where women were honored for their minds, their courage, their wit. She dared to ask, why do we measure a woman's worth in inches and pigments? What about her knowledge, her choices, her stories? She didn't just question the standard, she wrote a new one. And she wasn't alone. In Mughal India, Empress Nur Jahan didn't just wear the fashions, she designed them. She was a poet, a strategist, a cultural force. Coins bore her name. Architecture followed her vision. She didn't fit the mold. She melted it down and cast her own. These women weren't anomalies. They were blueprints. They showed that beauty could be defined by presence, by power, by purpose. But of course, the system didn't go down without a fight. In France, as beauty became theater under Louis XIV, everything got louder: powder, wigs, color. The court of Versailles became a spectacle of surface. Men and women alike wore rouge, high heels, extravagant silk. It wasn't just self-expression, it was politics. The more time you spent on appearance, the more it proved you didn't have to work. Beauty became performance art. Opulence became virtue. And yet, even in all that excess, the rules were rigid. Too dark, uncivilized, too thin, sickly, too confident, dangerous. Women learn to navigate this minefield with silent precision. A little blush, a certain walk, the right tilt of the head. Beauty wasn't just about standing out, it was about knowing when to disappear, until again, someone said no. And the next part of our journey, it's going to show you exactly how women took back their bodies, their clothes, their faces, and finally said, enough. In part 6, we'll unravel the rise of consumerism, the invention of beauty icons, and the slow-burning revolution that turned lipstick into protest. So stay with me, because we're not done yet. We've just scratched the surface. Let's begin this chapter not in a castle or a convent, but in a shop. A bright, glittering store window in the early 20th century. Lipsticks lined like bullets, face powders promising radiance, creams, lotions, potions, each one whispering, "Fix this, hide that, become her." Welcome to the age of consumer beauty. This is the era when beauty stops being just about class or piety and becomes a product, a business, an empire. With the invention of photography and later film, beauty ideals became more than regional, they became global. Movie stars like Greta Garbo, Clara Bow, and Josephine Baker lit up the screen with faces that defined a new kind of allure. Suddenly, women didn't just compare themselves to the girl next door. They were comparing themselves to icons, untouchable, perfect, carefully lit and impossibly smooth. Advertising exploded. Magazines told women what was in, what was out, what was desirable. Your face became a canvas for capitalism. Your body a battleground of trends. One year curves were in. The next, rail-thin silhouettes ruled the runway, and in between, confusion, exhaustion, expense. But here's what made it different now: the illusion of choice. Unlike medieval times, where a woman's beauty was defined by her religion or her husband's social rank, now she could buy her way into desirability. You weren't just born beautiful, you could become it, for a price. Companies knew this, and they played dirty. Skin-lightening creams were marketed aggressively to women of color, promising radiance but pushing colonial ideals. Anti-aging ads preyed on insecurity, framing wrinkles as failures. Even deodorant campaigns warned women that being natural was unacceptable. And yet, there was power here too. Makeup became armor, lipstick a weapon. In World War II, women were encouraged to wear red lipstick as a sign of morale, patriotism, even resistance. The message was clear: beauty wasn't weakness, it was strength, pride, a declaration that I'm still here. And when the second wave of feminism rose in the 1960s and 70s, beauty got political again. Some women rejected it outright, ditching razors, bras, cosmetics as a stand against the system. Others reclaimed it, using eyeliner and glitter and big hair as statements of visibility. You couldn't ignore them now. Across the world, different beauty movements erupted. Black is beautiful, Chicana feminism, indigenous resurgence, pride marches, drag balls, street fashion. Women and queer communities used style not just to conform, but to defy. Beauty standards began to fracture. Still, the beauty industry adapted. It always does. It co-opted rebellion, sold revolution in bottles, marketed empowerment as a commodity. But something else was happening underneath it all. The rise of self-expression. Not for him, not for the mirror, for you. Punk girls with shaved heads, goth kids in eyeliner and combat boots, riot GRRRLS in ripped tights and smeared lipstick. Beauty became messy, loud, political, and gloriously imperfect. And now we're swimming in a sea of contradictions. Filters smooth our faces while hashtags celebrate flaws. Ads push Botox beside body positivity slogans. We're told to love ourselves, but only after we fix ourselves. But look closer. Cracks are forming. People are pushing back. movements for inclusivity, for authenticity, for age, race, size, gender expression, models with vitiligo, trans beauty queens, disabled influencers, grandmothers in fashion campaigns. The landscape is changing, not fast enough, but undeniably. And maybe, just maybe, we're circling back, not to medieval rules, but to something older, deeper, to the idea that beauty isn't about perfection. It's about presence. In Part 7, we'll go even further into modern surgery, social media, and the digital distortions that shape how we see ourselves. Because the question isn't just what is beautiful, it's who profits when you don't feel like you are. And that's where the revolution begins. Now let's talk about smiles, or rather, the absence of them. Because in much of medieval Europe, a woman's face wasn't supposed to reveal too much. Joy, lust, laughter, those were considered dangerous emotions. And where do those emotions live? Right on the face. So women were taught to compose their expressions, to keep their faces serene, blank, delicate. Smiling too broadly wasn't just frowned upon, it could be interpreted as vulgar, loose, or foolish. A composed face meant restraint, virtue, purity. Beauty wasn't just how you looked, it was how well you could conceal. And this expectation carried far beyond the medieval era. Even in Renaissance portraits, you'll see noble women with closed lips and distant eyes. Their beauty was curated, not just by the artists, but by centuries of ideology. The less you revealed, the more desirable you were. But in other parts of the world, beauty allowed for more expression. In Mughal India, for example, the eyes were everything. Thick kohl lined the lashes, not just to enhance allure, but to ward off the evil eye. Red lips were painted with crushed flowers or beetles, a sign of vitality and charm. But even then, moderation was key. Too much makeup, too much expression, and you were accused of vanity or deception. In ancient China, facial beauty was poetic. Brows shaped like willows, eyes like calm lakes. The ideal woman was subtle, mysterious. Her gestures mattered more than her smile. A bowed head, a glance through a sleeve, these were the love letters of her face. Among the Maya and Aztec, beauty was bolder. Faces were painted for ritual, for power, for story. Tattoos, piercings, dyes, these were markers of identity and strength. Here, the face didn't hide, it proclaimed. And that brings us to a painful truth. The farther your natural features strayed from the cultural ideal, the more pressure you felt to change. What if your skin was too dark, your eyes too narrow, your lips too full? You were told, sometimes subtly, sometimes brutally, that you weren't beautiful, that you needed fixing. This wasn't just aesthetic, it was moral, because in many cultures, beauty was seen as a sign of goodness. A woman who was plain but modest might be praised, but a beautiful woman who knew she was beautiful, she was dangerous. Women were expected to balance an impossible scale, attractive but not seductive, elegant but not vain, present but not bold. If you succeeded, you were envied. If you failed, you were ridiculed. And this hasn't changed as much as we'd like to think. Today, we still live with the weight of curated faces, the filtered smile, the contour lines, the language of perfection whispered through ring lights and scrolling screens. But here's the secret. Beauty has never been about symmetry. It's been about submission. Because when you can control someone's face, you can control how they show up in the world. You don't just change how they look, you change how they move, how they speak, how they exist. But here's where women fought back. They turned makeup into armor. They wore colors that weren't approved. They laughed when told not to. They painted, pierced, perfumed, not for men, not for survival, but for self. That's where the real power lies, so let's keep going. Because we've looked at the face, we've spoken about the smile. But now, it's time to move down the body and ask the question that every century has tried to answer. What should a woman's body look like? And more importantly, who gets to decide? But let's pause here for a moment. Let's take a breath, not because we're done, but because we're about to enter one of the most quietly powerful chapters in the story of beauty: the hands. Yes, the hands, the ones that embroidered, that braided, that cooked and cured and cradled, that wrote letters and mixed balms and turned parchment into protest. In a world that often silenced women's voices, their hands kept speaking. Through thread, through ink, through touch. Imagine a woman in 14th century France. Her fingers stained with berries, rose petals, and the soft green of crushed herbs. She's mixing a concoction, not just for glow or perfume, but for healing. She's memorized recipes from her mother's mother, who learned them from a nun, who wrote them in the margin of a prayer book no man ever thought to read. Or picture a young woman in Edo period Japan. Her hands press indigo-dyed cloth against her cheeks, warming her skin before powdering it with fine rice. She draws her brows in a perfect arc, higher on the forehead than nature intended. But this isn't just vanity, it's precision, it's ritual, it's art. Across Africa, women's hands grind shea nuts into butter. They braid intricate cornrows that map genealogy, language, pride. Each twist and tuck a sentence, a signature. In Renaissance Italy, noble women embroidered cushions with verses, some sacred, some scandalous. And in the shadows of monasteries, fingers copied manuscripts by candlelight. Latin texts, medical scrolls, secret knowledge hidden between lines of devotion. Even calloused hands read from work, swollen from harvest. Those hands told stories. The peasants' hands, the midwives, the warriors and widows, not soft or perfumed but strong, capable, revered in their own right. Because here's the truth. Beauty wasn't only in the face or the waistline. It was in gesture, in movement, in skill. And when we talk about hands, we have to talk about touch, about what it meant to be held, to hold. In some cultures, touch was power. In others, danger. In medieval Europe, unmarried men and women were forbidden from touching. A brush of fingers could mean scandal, but in the privacy of a home. A wife massaged her husband's back with oils. A mother soothed a fevered child. A friend wiped away tears. Touch was medicine. Touch was memory. And yes, touch was rebellion. There were women who tattooed their hands with symbols of protection. Others who painted them with henna before rituals, weddings, battles. Designs passed down through generations, different in every village, but all whispering the same truth. I was here. I made beauty. I mattered. And maybe that's why this part of the story matters so much. Because the hands remind us that beauty isn't always seen. Sometimes it's made. Sometimes it's given. Sometimes it's held. So as we step into part 9, let's look at what those hands made. Let's talk about the rituals women built in kitchens, gardens, baths, and burial grounds. Let's follow the scent of rose oil and the sound of weaving looms into the secret chambers where beauty and belief intertwined. Let's take a moment to breathe, because where we're heading next might hit a little too close to home. You see, by the time we get to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, beauty stopped being just a symbol of class or virtue. It started becoming a business. And that changed everything. Advertisements began popping up in newspapers and magazines, telling women exactly what they were lacking: freckle cream, hair tonic, bust enhancers, waist reducers, lip rouge. There was no limit to what could be sold if you made women feel like they weren't enough. And let's be clear, this wasn't just suggestion, it was pressure, constant, relentless. Imagine walking into a store and seeing an ad that said, "Are your elbows too dark? Fix them today," or "unsightly hair. You'll never find a husband that way." It sounds absurd now, but those were real campaigns. They didn't invent insecurity, but they sure knew how to profit from it. And just like that, beauty became something to buy, something to earn, something you could fail at. But even then, women didn't just sit back and absorb it. Many pushed back. Some even stepped into the industry themselves. African American entrepreneurs like Madame C.J. Walker built entire empires making products for black women, by black women, offering not just cosmetics, but pride, independence, jobs, and representation. It was beauty as self-definition, not self-erasure. And in the roaring 1920s, makeup stopped being shameful. Flappers wore it proudly: red lips, kohl-rimmed eyes, rouge on their cheeks. Beauty wasn't something to hide. It was something to flaunt. Still, for every step forward, there was always a backward pull. Hollywood exploded onto the scene, bringing with it a new wave of ideals: glamorous, airbrushed, unattainable. Actresses were lit to look perfect, their images retouched, and the rest of the world left to compare themselves to fiction. By the 1950s, the pendulum swung again. After the chaos of war, society longed for order. Beauty became domestic, controlled, safe. The ideal woman was now a housewife with curled hair, red lipstick, a tidy waistline, and a roast in the oven. Magazines promised tips to please your husband and keep your skin wrinkle-free. It wasn't just about looking good. It was about keeping the world calm. But then came the 60s and 70s, and the fabric of beauty standards began to fray. The civil rights movement, second-wave feminism, the sexual revolution, all of it cracked open the conversation around bodies, choice, and visibility. Suddenly, natural hair was political. Going braless was protest. Wearing pants wasn't just practical, it was revolutionary. And fashion followed suit. Bell-bottoms, tie-dye, afros, miniskirts, platform shoes, they weren't just trends. They were declarations. Beauty wasn't one shape, one color, or one size anymore. It was a kaleidoscope. Of course, this shift wasn't smooth. Every step toward freedom met resistance, but the message had changed. It was no longer be beautiful to belong. It was define beauty on your terms. And as we moved into the 80s and 90s, the war over beauty standards became even louder. Supermodels dominated the media. Beauty got taller, thinner, blonder. Then came the rise of grunge, minimalism, and the backlash against commercial glam. But all of that would pale in comparison to what came next: the internet. Suddenly, beauty was everywhere and nowhere. Every scroll, every click, every filtered face told a story. But it wasn't always true. Photoshop changed how we saw reality. Instagram created a loop of endless comparison, and beauty became something we consumed in seconds. We'll dive deeper into that in the next chapter. But before we do, let me leave you with this. If beauty once meant stillness, silence, submission, today it's something else entirely. It's chaotic, it's diverse. It's broken and remade every day. And that might just be the most beautiful thing of all. Let's pause for a moment, because we've traveled far. From stone castles and silent veils to corsets, courtship, and coded fashion. But now we're going somewhere even deeper. Not just under the skin, but into the bloodstream of beauty itself. Power, perception, and propaganda. Imagine standing in a Renaissance palace. Marble floors, gilded ceilings. A painter crouches before a canvas, dabbing pale pigment onto a noblewoman's face. Not because she's ill, but because that ghostly complexion was fashionable. Because her beauty wasn't just personal, it was political. Portraits weren't truth. They were strategy. Every angle, every curl, every shade of rouge spoke a message. A royal daughter might be painted with pale skin, wide eyes, a demure smile, not because that's what she looked like, but because it would appeal to a prince across the sea. Marriage was alliance. Beauty was diplomacy. And who held the brush? Mostly men. Kings, dukes, popes commissioned these images. They defined what was beautiful because they had the power to decide what was desirable. But that didn't mean women had no say. Some fought back, not with weapons, but with wit, art, and intellect. Christine de Pizan, writing in the early 1400s, dared to ask why beauty was always tied to virtue. Why a woman's worth had to be measured in softness and silence. She challenged the male poets of her time, crafting a vision of women as thinkers, builders, leaders, not just muses. Her work was radical, but it wasn't alone. Across cultures, women left clues, subtle, coded, but defiant. In Mughal India, Empress Nur Jahan didn't just wear the jewels, she designed them. She chose fabrics, influenced architecture, set beauty trends. She was both subject and artist, both muse and maker. In the Islamic world, beauty rituals flourished in hammams, public bathhouses where women gathered. They scrubbed, perfumed, shared stories. It was intimacy, community, sisterhood. And that mattered because in societies where women's voices were limited, these spaces gave them power. Quiet power, but power nonetheless. And in sub-Saharan Africa, beauty rituals weren't just about looking good. They were about connection. Shea butter for the skin, braids that told stories of lineage, face paint for ceremony. Every mark, every scent, every color was rooted in something bigger than appearance. It was culture, identity, resistance. But here's where things take a turn. As colonial powers spread across the globe, they didn't just bring guns and gold. They brought ideals. Western standards of beauty, pale skin, narrow noses, straight hair, began to overwrite centuries of tradition. Indigenous practices were mocked. A erased, demonized. Suddenly, skin-lightening creams appeared, hair-straightening tools, ads that told women they needed to be civilized to be seen, to be valued, and even today that legacy lingers. We still see it in magazines, in film, on runways. Lighter skin, thinner bodies, Eurocentric features dominate. And yet all around the world people are pushing back, reclaiming what was lost, honoring what was hidden. Natural hair movements, traditional tattoos, indigenous fashion. These aren't just trends, they're revolutions. Women are saying, my body is not a battleground. My beauty is not a bargain. Because beauty has always been more than aesthetic. It's been used as a weapon, a shield, a currency, a conversation. So as we move forward, let's keep asking, who gets to decide what's beautiful? And why have we been listening to the same voices for so long? In part 11, we'll peel back another layer, how mirrors, makeup, and the rise of the beauty industry transformed self-perception forever. Until then, remember, the reflection in the glass is never the whole story. The real beauty, it's in the legacy you carry. Let's step back into the story. By now, we've seen how beauty was laced, powdered, veiled, and weaponized. But what happens when the battleground isn't just the body, but the face that greets the world? In this chapter, we stare down the mirror, literally, and ask what it means to wear a face that pleases others more than it represents yourself. In medieval and early modern Europe, a woman's face was expected to radiate two things: purity and restraint, a soft gaze, a pale complexion, lips painted just enough to suggest bloom but not too much lest you seem vain, and above all, stillness. Because a still face meant a still soul, no outbursts, no bold smiles, no loud laughter. It wasn't just art, it was surveillance. The face was a performance, and those performances were documented. Portraits of noblewomen weren't snapshots of personality. They were carefully curated messages to the world. The goal wasn't to show who she was. It was to show that she was wanted, virtuous, and, above all, controllable. Fast forward to the invention of clearer mirrors, and suddenly beauty got personal. In the Renaissance, mirrors became more widely available, and for the first time people began to see themselves with clarity, sometimes too much clarity. This sparked a shift. Grooming turned into an obsession. Complexions were scrutinized. Flaws became fixable, or so it seemed. The rise of cosmetics, skin treatments, and elaborate grooming rituals wasn't just about vanity. It was about social survival. Because the more you could perfect your image, the more likely you were to rise. But even then, the tools of the trade were double-edged. Face powders were laced with arsenic or lead. Lip stains came from crushed insects or toxic dyes. Skin-lightening potions were harsh and dangerous. Still, women kept using them. Because a woman with a flawless face wasn't just admired, she was believed. She was trusted. She was worthy. And here's the dark twist. If you failed to meet those expectations, you weren't just dismissed, you could be punished. A woman who wore too much rouge could be accused of prostitution. One who smiled too freely might be considered immoral. One who neglected her appearance could be labeled lazy or unfit for marriage. And that's the thread that keeps showing up through history. The face as a moral scoreboard. Let's shift focus to the East for a moment. In classical Chinese culture, beauty was poetic. The curve of an eyebrow could tell a love story. The shape of the eyes was compared to crescent moons or autumn pools. Cosmetics were subtle, almost spiritual. Rouge on the cheeks symbolized youth and harmony. Rice powder gave the skin an ethereal glow. But again, restraint was the rule. The ideal woman was demure, composed, unreadable. In India, the eyes were portals of allure and protection. Kajal lined the lids not just for drama, but to ward off evil spirits. Henna was painted in elaborate designs across hands and faces during weddings and festivals, not as decoration, but as blessings. And saffron or sandalwood pastes were used not just for brightness, but to purify and sanctify. Across the Islamic world, the eyes became a symphony. Veiling made the gaze more powerful. Kohl darkened the lashes and outlined the soul. A single glance could carry mystery, strength, even seduction. Beauty, when restricted, finds sharper tools. But let's return to the West, because something interesting happens in the Enlightenment. The face becomes a theater. With the rise of salons and court society, appearance becomes public performance. Wigs towered to absurd heights. Moles were applied deliberately, sometimes shaped like stars, ships, or crescent moons. Makeup was so thick it could crack. But it wasn't about realism, it was about spectacle. And here's the kicker: men participated too. At the court of Louis XIV, it wasn't uncommon for men to wear heels, rouge, and powdered wigs. The gender line around beauty was blurrier than we think. Because beauty in this age wasn't about femininity, it was about power. But every performance ends. As revolutions swept through France and beyond, excess became dangerous. Suddenly, powdered faces were symbols of oppression. Simplicity returned. Naturalness became the new ideal, but even natural took work. And through all of this, the burden of the face remained. In every culture, across every century, a woman's face told a story, one she didn't always write. Whether it was veiled, painted, powdered, or bare, it carried expectations of virtue, of beauty, of silence. So now we ask, what if your face didn't have to carry all that weight? What if the arch of your brow, the line of your jaw, the gap in your teeth, the furrow in your forehead, what if they weren't flaws or virtues, but simply truths? In the next chapter, we'll leave the face and return to the body. We'll explore how the female form itself became a battlefield, from waistlines to foot binding, from hourglass silhouettes to skeletal ideals. Because beauty, as we're learning, isn't a single mask. It's a legacy of survival. See you in part 12. Let's return to the mirror, not the kind that reflects back flawless filters or face-altering apps, but the ancient, polished bronze that once gave a woman only the vaguest shimmer of herself. Because here, in the haze of time, we begin to see something strange, something powerful, a shift. You see, somewhere between the late 19th and early 20th centuries, beauty began changing faster than ever before. Not because the human body changed, but because the world did. Industrialization roared in, dragging with it modern medicine, photography, global trade, and mass production. And suddenly, beauty was no longer confined to courtly halls or whispered rituals. It was everywhere. On billboards, in newspapers, in storefronts. Enter the age of the beauty industry. For centuries, women had mixed their own powders and pastes, shared recipes in gardens and cloisters. But now, for the first time, you could buy beauty in a bottle. Tonics, creams, elixirs, many of them still unregulated, many promising impossible results. Lighten your skin, remove freckles, slim your figure, smell like violets, be desirable. The advertising was relentless and calculated. Fair skin still ruled the day, but now it was repackaged as a product. Big business realized something chilling: insecurity sells. And women, raised on centuries of measuring themselves against perfection, became ideal consumers. Magazines emerged as a new kind of scripture. Vogue, Harper's Bazaar. They didn't just report on fashion, they created it. They told you what was beautiful and, more importantly, what wasn't. A single photo could birth a trend, and a single flaw could ruin a reputation. But the power of the image didn't stop there. As photography improved, beauty became more standardized and more unforgiving. A portrait once painted with flattering brushstrokes was now replaced by a stark black and white photograph. There was no hiding in oil paint, no soft focus. The camera demanded symmetry, clarity, flawlessness. Then came the silver screen. Hollywood exploded into culture like a bomb of light and desire. Silent film stars like Clara Bow and Theda Bara defined the first wave of cinematic beauty. Heavy-lidded eyes, Cupid's bow lips, expressive faces framed by perfectly waved bobs. They were sultry, but unreachable. And for the first time, women across the world looked to a glowing screen and asked, "Am I supposed to look like that?" The answer was yes and no, because even as film pushed one ideal, real women lived in complexity. In World War I and II, women filled factories, built weapons, ran households alone. Their hands were calloused, their hair tied back, their figures strong from labor. And yet, the pressure to remain beautiful never disappeared. Victory rolls and red lipstick weren't just styles, they were patriotism. Propaganda posters showed women glamorous even in war gear. Beauty, once again, became duty. But beneath the surface, something else was brewing. Feminism was rising again, louder, more urgent. In the 1960s and 70s, women's liberation movements challenged everything: the workplace, the household, the bedroom, and yes, the mirror. Feminists asked, why do we wear makeup? Why do we shave? Who decided this was beautiful? Some women burned bras, others designed their own fashion. Some shaved their heads, others went natural. The point wasn't uniformity, it was choice. For the first time in a long time, women were loudly asking, who benefits from my insecurity? And it wasn't just white, Western women leading this charge. Across the globe, women of color began reclaiming their beauty traditions, their skin, their hair, their shape. Afros weren't just hairstyles, they were protests. Saris weren't just garments, they were declarations. Indigenous beadwork wasn't decoration, it was identity made visible. Yet even as women fought for freedom, the system evolved to adapt. Plastic surgery advanced. Diet culture exploded. Photoshop was invented. The supermodel emerged, tall, thin, flawless, and global. Faces were no longer unique. They became interchangeable. And just like medieval maidens plucking hairlines to fit an impossible ideal, modern women began chasing a fantasy sculpted by lighting, editing, and algorithms. But there is hope, because the story isn't over. In our next chapter, we'll explore how beauty became data, likes, shares, filters, and algorithms. How social media both destroyed and democratized beauty. How the most ancient of questions, am I enough, echoes louder than ever, and how some are finally daring to answer yes. See you in part 13. But here's the irony of history. While women were being molded, monitored, and measured against impossible ideals, they were also shaping the world around them in quiet, deliberate ways. Take the embroidery needle, for instance. What looked like domestic work was often a woman's only artistic outlet. Threads weren't just colored floss, they were stories. A stitched flower could represent a lost child. A gold-threaded phoenix might echo the legend of a woman reborn from grief. In some households, embroidery was more than pastime, it was protest. If you weren't allowed to speak in court, you could speak in silk. And generations later, we still see those whispers in museums locked behind glass, their colors barely faded. Now let's talk scent. A scent so often forgotten in historical records, but so intimate. In places like Persia, India, and North Africa, scent was sacred. Oils of jasmine, rose, myrrh, rubbed into hair, massaged onto skin, wafted through temples and hammams. In medieval Europe, women carried pomanders, tiny balls of fragrant herbs and spices, around their necks or tucked in their sleeves. Why? To ward off disease, yes, but also to comfort, to calm, to claim space in a world that rarely gave them any. Even music, yes, music, was part of the beauty ritual. In ancient China and Japan, women played zithers and flutes not only for entertainment, but as an extension of their grace and refinement. A single note could convey longing, sorrow, joy. And the sound of a woman's voice, whether singing or storytelling, was sometimes the only public expression allowed. What you couldn't say with your face or your clothes, you could sometimes say with sound. And what about dance? Across cultures, from temple dances in India to the rhythmic footwork of Moorish Spain to the spiritual stomp of West African rituals, movement was beauty in motion. Not for male pleasure, but for divine connection, for celebration, for identity. Dance allowed the body to speak when words were forbidden. But let's zoom in again, because even the simplest acts like washing one's face held meaning. In some cultures, morning beauty rituals were tied to the sun, to prayers, to a cycle older than civilization. A basin of water, a touch of oil, a moment alone. These weren't vain gestures, they were sacred. They said, I exist. I care for myself, even when the world does not. And that perhaps is the thread that ties all these stories together. From the bound feet of Qing dynasty brides, to the soot-lined eyes of Egyptian queens, to the wind-chapped cheeks of a milkmaid in Flanders, beauty was a way of surviving, of signaling, of resisting, and sometimes of simply remembering who you were. Because in every culture across every age, women found ways to leave marks on their skin, their hair, their clothes, their children, their walls. Marks that said, I lived, I mattered, I chose. So before we roll our eyes at old beauty standards or judge the women who followed them, maybe we need to look deeper. Not at the surface, but at the meaning beneath it. Because beauty wasn't just a mirror. It was a message. And in part 14, we'll dig into how that message began to shift. When mass media, colonialism, and capitalism began rewriting the rules. When beauty became a global business. When the power to define began slipping from the hands of women into the hands of those who saw profit instead of poetry. But beauty doesn't stop at what we wear or how we look. It also lives in how we move, how we carry ourselves through the world. And here's the thing. Posture, gait, and movement have all been part of beauty standards for centuries. In many cultures, a woman's walk was studied and judged. In medieval Europe, noblewomen were expected to glide, not walk with purpose, not stride like a man. No, they were taught to float, soft steps, lowered gaze, tiny strides. That wasn't just about elegance. It was about control, about signaling to the world that you weren't in a rush, that you had the leisure to move slowly, deliberately, gracefully. Now picture this, a young girl in a noble court, balancing a book on her head, being trained to walk perfectly straight. Posture was moral, a curved back, a slouch, signs of laziness or looseness. A straight spine and lifted chin were not just beautiful, they were virtuous. And these ideas didn't vanish with time. Flash forward to the 19th century and beyond, and we see schools that taught deportment, how to walk, sit, and gesture properly. A lady's elegance, they said, began with how she entered a room. Even today, think about modeling schools, beauty pageants, or debutante balls. The training isn't just in makeup, it's in motion. A beautiful woman wasn't just still, she was choreographed. But here's the twist. Some women turned that choreography into power. Think about dancers. In India, the temple dancers, the Devadasis, performed ancient rituals with grace and symbolism. Every movement meant something. A raised hand, a glance over the shoulder, a precise turn of the ankle. These weren't random. They were sacred. They told stories through the body. In Africa, movement and beauty have long been inseparable. Traditional dances weren't just about rhythm. They were about storytelling, celebration, flirtation, strength. A woman's posture, sway, and expression could tell you whether she was mourning, rejoicing, or preparing for marriage. Even in wartime, movement mattered. Think of the women warriors, yes, warriors, who had to move with both beauty and force. The Dahomey Amazons were known for their elegance in battle. Deadly, yes, but also disciplined. Their drills were dances. Their marches had rhythm. Their posture always upright, always commanding. And in Japan, the geisha's walk small, silent, controlled, was an art in itself. The way she turned her wrist, the way she bowed her head, even the way she sipped tea, all choreographed. All meaningful, beauty in stillness, beauty in motion. Now ask yourself, who benefits when women are told to move smaller, to take up less space, to walk slower, talk softer, keep their gestures tight and polite? That's not just beauty, it's containment. Because posture isn't neutral, it's been politicized. Who gets to walk with confidence, to swagger, to take long strides without judgment? And who gets taught to shrink? But here's the good news. Movement is also where rebellion begins. When women run marathons in skirts, when they dance in the streets, when they climb, box, spar, sprint, when they take the stage and claim every inch of it, that's beauty too. That's power. And like every part of this story, it's about choice. Because beauty isn't just about how others see you. It's about how you move through the world on your own terms. In part 15, we're diving into the voice, the sound of beauty. From whispers to war cries, lullabies to speeches, we'll explore how women's voices have been shaped, silenced, celebrated, and reclaimed. And so we arrive at a truth that's echoed across centuries. Beauty, while often framed as something soft or superficial, has always had sharp edges. It's been a battlefield, a mirror, a burden, a power. Let's sit with that power for a moment. Because when we trace it, not just in portraits and poetry, but in policy, punishment, and praise, we start to see something deeper. Beauty has never just been about admiration. It's been about access, about control, about the right to be seen. In ancient Greece, philosophers debated beauty as a moral virtue. In medieval Europe, it was linked to piety. In Renaissance courts, it was status. In colonial regimes, it was a weapon. And in every one of those systems, someone was excluded. Someone was told, you don't belong. But here's what they didn't count on: resilience. Because for every imposed ideal, there's always been someone pushing back. A girl mixing herbs in secret. A mother braiding stories into her daughter's hair. A woman stepping outside with no paint on her face, no corset at her ribs, daring the world to see her on her terms. Let's talk about the Black experience for a minute. Throughout history, and especially during colonial rule, European beauty standards were forced onto Black communities. Kinky hair was called unkempt. Dark skin was demonized. African adornment was labeled savage. But Black women fought back. They preserved rituals in braids, in beads, in butters and oils passed down through generations. During slavery in the Americas, women used cowrie shells, wraps, and headscarves not just for beauty, but for protection. Identity, defiance. In the 20th century, the civil rights and Black power movements reclaimed natural hair. The afro became a crown, a political statement, a refusal to shrink. And what about the rise of global beauty industries? As commerce expanded and media went international, beauty ideals became exportable. Thinness, paleness, straight hair, these traits were sold as universal. Magazines, film, TV, ads, all reinforcing one narrow image of what was desirable. But even here, cracks formed. In the 1990s and 2000s, we began to see resistance take the stage. Supermodels from Brazil, Sudan, China. Runways featuring fuller figures, differently abled bodies, aging skin. Voices rising from every corner saying, "We are here. We are many. We are beautiful," which brings us to now. The 2020s are a paradox. We live in the age of filters and Facetune, but also of body positivity. Social media both distorts and democratizes. We see unattainable perfection, but we also see raw, real beauty. Acne, scars, bellies, laugh lines. Movement, and what's more powerful, a sculpted face or a fearless one. Because beauty today isn't just a mirror anymore, it's a microphone. It's a platform. It's how we show up, speak up, and take up space. And the people leading that charge, they're not always celebrities or designers. They're everyday warriors, students, mothers, survivors, creators. So where do we go from here? We keep asking questions. We keep telling stories. We keep teaching our children that beauty isn't something you earn through suffering. It's something you carry, something you shape, something you pass on. Because beauty, in its truest form, has never been about being chosen. It's about choosing yourself. In the next chapter, we're going to peel back one of the last great myths, that beauty is for women alone. We'll explore how men, through war, vanity, ritual, and revolution, have shaped and been shaped by beauty too. Because this story, it belongs to everyone. Now let's return to the body, not the body as object, but as memory, as story. Because by the early modern period, beauty wasn't just about what you wore or how you looked. It was about what your body symbolized. And the symbolism, it got heavier. In 17th century Europe, particularly in the courts of France and England, a woman's silhouette became more than fashion. It became architecture. Layers of stays, corsets, panniers, and bustles restructured the female form into impossible proportions. Tiny waist, towering hair, immobile skirts. But underneath all that grandeur was a quiet war. Women were trapped, sometimes literally, inside the fashions of power. And yet they still found ways to move, to bend the rules, to breathe. Sometimes that meant reshaping fashion itself. In the 18th century, women like Marie Antoinette became style icons, yes, but also provocateurs. Her towering powdered wigs were political satire. Her shepherdess gowns mocked court excess by pretending to embrace simplicity. And her critics weren't just scandalized by her influence, they were afraid of it. Because when a woman shapes culture, she shapes power. And fashion wasn't the only battlefield. Cosmetics in this era became more refined and more deadly. Lead, mercury, and arsenic still appeared in face powders and blushes. Blue veins were painted on pale skin to enhance the illusion of fragility. Lip color came from crushed insects. Eye drops from deadly nightshade made pupils dilate seductively, but could also blind you. Beauty had always demanded sacrifice. Now it asked for silence too. A woman who appeared too concerned with her looks risked being called vain, even immoral. But a woman who ignored beauty was dismissed as uncouth or lazy. So again, women walked that tightrope, looking beautiful, but not too much, smiling but not too broadly, aging but only gracefully. And what about aging? Let's pause there. Because in almost every culture we've looked at, beauty has been framed as something young, smooth, unwrinkled, but that wasn't always the case. In many indigenous cultures, age brought status and beauty. Gray hair, facial lines, a weathered body. These were signs of wisdom, proof that you'd lived. In West African societies, elder women were respected not despite their age, but because of it. In Japan, the concept of wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection and transience, found grace in the creases. In Andean and Quechua cultures, grandmothers were central to beauty rituals, not sidelined from them. But colonization and later, industrialization began to erase these ideals. As Western beauty standards spread through colonial rule and global trade, Youth became a commodity. An empire of anti-aging was born. One wrinkle, one gray hair, something to fix. And who profited from that fear? The beauty industry. By the 19th century, beauty had fully commercialized. Perfume houses, powder puffs, hair dyes, slimming garments, and skin lighteners flooded the market. Most were unregulated. Many were dangerous. But all of them sold the same thing: transformation. You weren't just selling a product, you were selling a promise. That if you wore this scent, your life would be more romantic. That if your waist measured 18 inches, you'd be admired. That if your skin was pale, your virtue would be obvious. And the problem with promises is they're rarely kept. But here's where we start to see the shift. Because by the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th, women weren't just beauty consumers, they were creators, entrepreneurs, chemists, innovators. Madame C.J. Walker, a black woman born to formerly enslaved parents, built a hair care empire that employed thousands of women and made her one of the first female self-made millionaires in the U.S. Elizabeth Arden, Helena Rubinstein, Annie Turnbow Malone. These women turned creams and lipsticks into economic powerhouses. They built salons, hired women, funded education. Suddenly, beauty wasn't just about compliance. It was a career, but the battle wasn't over. Because even as women shaped the industry, they still had to operate within the confines of male-dominated ideals. Most mainstream advertising still centered whiteness, thinness, youth, heteronormativity. So women kept fighting, through zines, through protests, through film, photography, and later through the digital world. And here's where the thread ties back to everything we've seen: the body as story, the face as protest, the dress as armor, because beauty, despite its trappings, has always carried something sacred, even when it's manipulated, even when it's punished. Because when a woman stands in her skin on her terms, she's not just wearing beauty, she's wielding it. In the next part, we'll look at how this revolution continues, online, in movements, in subcultures, and in the quiet moments where someone looks in the mirror and finally sees themselves. Now let's turn the page to something that rarely gets talked about, but shaped countless lives across centuries: the beauty of silence and the power of the unspoken. In many cultures, especially throughout the medieval and early modern eras, a woman's worth was measured not just in how she looked, but how little she said. Stillness wasn't just seen as grace, it was demanded. Silence wasn't just a virtue, it was a survival strategy. A woman who spoke too much, too freely, too boldly, she was dangerous, untrustworthy, possibly even bewitched. But a quiet woman, a woman who kept her opinions tucked behind her teeth and her pain beneath her skin, was praised. She was considered beautiful, and the pressure to stay silent seeped into everything: marriage customs, religious life, even fashion. Veils didn't just cover the hair, they cloaked expression. Downcast eyes weren't just a pose, they were a lesson. And for many, even laughter had rules. But here's the paradox. Even in a world that demanded silence, women still found ways to speak. Sometimes with embroidery, sometimes with song, sometimes with coded language passed between generations, between locked doors, behind altar walls. Take, for example, the women troubadours of southern France in the 12th century, called troubadours. They composed verses of longing, defiance, humor, even criticism of the very men who silenced them. Their poems didn't always survive, but their audacity did. Or the women mystics, like Hildegard of Bingen, who cloaked radical visions of divine femininity in religious language. She wrote music, texts, scientific theories, and she used her spiritual authority to be heard in ways other women couldn't. Her beauty wasn't in her appearance, it was in her mind, her fire, her refusal to shrink. And even outside the courts and convents, everyday women told their stories in the rhythm of the loom, in the recipes that healed, in the lullabies sung to daughters. Their voices carried, whether written down or not. Because true beauty, as history quietly teaches us, isn't loud or showy or perfect. Sometimes it's tucked into the corners, folded into linens, whispered at dusk. Sometimes it lives in restraint, and sometimes in rebellion. In the next part, we'll step into the world of scent, sound, and ritual, where beauty wasn't worn or spoken but experienced, where the body became an altar and adornment was a prayer. Let's take a breath, because where we're heading now, well, it's not just about skin or fabric anymore. It's about the mirror, not the one hanging on your wall, but the one inside your head. The one that asks, every time you catch your reflection, do I measure up? Let's talk about mirrors, because they changed everything. Before the invention of clear, silver-backed mirrors in the 13th century, reflections were a rare and unreliable thing. You might catch your face in polished metal or still water, but it was blurry, distant, more suggestion than reality. And that meant people weren't obsessed with every line or flaw. Beauty was understood more by how others described it, poets, painters, priests, not by what you personally scrutinized. But once those bright glass mirrors entered homes and halls, something shifted. Suddenly people, especially women, could see every inch of themselves, every blemish, every curve, every flaw. And where attention goes, so follows anxiety. The reflection that once felt mystical became something to correct. By the Renaissance, grooming had evolved into a performance. Toiletry tables were filled with brushes, jars, pomades, and not just for health. Oh no. These were tools of transformation, lead-based powders for the skin, belladonna drops to dilate the pupils and make the eyes look more seductive, rouge for the cheeks, veil for the mystery, and mirrors watched it all. The obsession with looking right wasn't just about vanity, it was about value. A woman's worth was tied to how well she matched the ideal. And the ideal, always shifting, always narrowing, always slipping just out of reach. It wasn't just nobles. Even peasant girls began comparing. As soon as a girl saw what the elite looked like through portraits, through gossip, through fashion trickling down, she started measuring. Her freckles, her figure, her smile. Comparison became a new form of captivity, and this was no accident. Because as trade routes opened and colonial empires expanded, beauty became exportable. European standards, pale skin, delicate features, thin waists, began to seep into other parts of the world, often overriding or demonizing native beauty. And let's be honest, this wasn't about aesthetics, it was about control. Colonizers didn't just bring weapons, they brought mirrors. They brought judgment. They told entire civilizations that their natural beauty was uncivilized, that their skin was too dark, their hair too coarse, their customs too strange. But here's where it gets powerful. Women didn't just submit to this. Many pushed back. They painted their faces in tribal patterns. They continued traditional hair rituals. They passed down stories through beads, scarves, combs, and oils. Because beauty, real beauty, wasn't something you could conquer. It adapted. It resisted. It survived. Still, the pressure remained. By the 18th and 19th centuries, beauty became more than a custom. It became a market. With industrialization came mass production. Lipsticks in tubes, creams in tins, soap in branded wrappers. And with those products came advertisements, images of what a woman should be. Smooth, pale, soft, symmetrical, silent. Posters, pamphlets, and newspapers began to flood homes with reminders. Here's what's wrong with you. Here's how to fix it. Buy this, try that, look like her. And the mirror, it was always watching. By now, beauty had morphed into performance. And not just for royalty, but for every woman who walked into a store, every girl who looked at a magazine. The private space of the body became public property. And the mirror didn't just reflect, it accused. But here's the twist. Even with all that pressure, even with mirrors everywhere, some women chose differently. They laughed louder, walked taller, stopped apologizing for taking up space. In every era, there were women who said, "I am not your doll. I am not your canvas. I am not your commodity." They didn't reject beauty, they redefined it. In poetry, in protest, in tradition, in silence. So tonight, as we wrap part 18, I want you to sit with this. Mirrors can be cruel, yes, but they can also be reclaimed. A mirror can be a tool of judgment or a window into your story. And your story, it's beautiful. In part 19, we'll explore how the modern world took the ancient dance of beauty and twisted it into something digital. Filters, Facetune, the age of the selfie. What happens when the mirror moves into your pocket and never stops judging? If you've been with us on this journey through beauty, control, and history, thank you. Because tonight, in part 19, we're stepping into our own century. A time when the mirror isn't just on the wall, it's in our pockets, on our screens, in our feed. Welcome to the digital age of beauty. Let's start with the obvious, the selfie. It seems harmless, right? A snap of your face. A moment of confidence. A new lipstick. A good hair day. But behind that photo is a tidal wave of algorithms, edits, expectations, and a quiet, constant question. Is this good enough to post? Before social media, a mirror was a private affair. Now it's public. Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, they've turned our faces into performance stages. We don't just check our reflections anymore. We curate them. Filter them, smooth them. Sometimes we barely recognize ourselves. And here's the thing, the tools are smarter than ever. With one swipe, you can slim your nose, plump your lips, brighten your eyes, change your jawline. Apps like Facetune and Beauty Plus promise perfection. But they sell something else too, insecurity. Because once you see yourself perfected, your natural face starts to feel like a mistake. And this is ancient. It's the same script, rewritten with pixels. The same message medieval women got from priests and painters. Hide your flaws, control your body, follow the rules. Only now the rules are faster, louder, and global. Think about it. When you scroll through your feed, how often do you see the same face? Smooth skin, pouty lips, defined cheekbones, winged liner. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, the aesthetic is eerily consistent. That's not coincidence. That's digital colonialism. Western beauty standards, pale skin, slim noses, symmetrical features, have gone viral. They dominate filters. They dominate algorithms. And they're flattening the gorgeous diversity of the world into one narrow look. But people are fighting back. From South Korea to Nigeria to Brazil, creators are reclaiming their features, showing their skin, sharing their scars, wearing their natural hair, celebrating melanin, laughing with teeth that aren't straight, skin that isn't smooth, eyes that aren't symmetrical. Because somewhere in all this noise, a new message is rising. Enough is enough. We are not avatars. We are not edits. We are not trends. We are real. And it's not just individuals pushing back. Entire movements are growing. Body positivity, skin neutrality, anti-filter campaigns. Brands are being called out. Celebrities are being unmasked. Kids are learning the difference between real and retouched. And yet, we're still human. We still crave beauty. That's not wrong. Wanting to feel attractive, radiant, seen, it's one of the oldest human desires. But when that desire becomes a prison, when it becomes a daily panic about your pores or your waist or your smile lines, that's when we have to ask, who is profiting off our shame? Spoiler, it's not you. But here's the hopeful part. The mirror may be digital now, but it's still yours. You decide how long you stand in front of it. You decide when to turn it off. You decide what version of yourself walks into the world. And when you choose realness over perfection, you don't just free yourself, you start cracking the system. You remind the world that beauty isn't a filter. It's not a trend. It's not even always visible. It's in the laugh lines, the crooked teeth, the tired eyes, the voice that trembles but speaks anyway. So as we head into part 20, our final chapter, we'll ask the question we've been circling all along. If beauty has always been a form of power, then what happens when we claim it, not as performance, but as presence? And so we arrive at the end of this long journey. We've wandered through candlelit castles and crowded marketplaces. We've stood in the heat of North African deserts and under the cherry blossoms of Hainan, Japan. We've felt the tug of corsets and the weight of powdered wigs. And through it all, we've seen one truth rise again and again. Beauty is never just about appearance. It's about power, identity, resistance, memory. Every era has tried to tame the female form, to bind it, paint it, shrink it, idealize it, sell it. And still women pushed back, with songs, with style, with silence. They reshaped the narrative every time someone tried to write them out of it. Whether it was a girl painting her face with berry juice in a medieval village or a queen redefining court fashion, beauty became a kind of language. One that spoke when women weren't allowed to. One that said, I am here. I am worthy. I will not disappear. And the echoes of those voices live on in every choice we make about how to present ourselves. In the morning routines that are part ritual, part armor. in the decisions we make about our hair, our skin, our scent, our posture. It's not just vanity, it's legacy. So maybe the real lesson isn't how beauty standards have changed, but how we've always survived them, outwitted them, reimagined them. And as we move forward, let's carry this with us. Your beauty doesn't have to fit anyone else's mold. It doesn't have to ask permission. It doesn't have to be quiet. Because every freckle, every curve, every scar, every strand, it tells a story. Not of flaw, but of becoming. So to every viewer watching tonight, thank you for walking this path with me. Thank you for seeing history not as something behind us, but something still unfolding. You are part of that story now. Write it well. And with that, rest well, dream deep, and never forget. The most powerful kind of beauty has always been the kind that refuses to be erased. Good night.